Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amanda Blair, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of the Robinson Institute to Making Babies in the 21st Century. We'll be having a chat with our guests, leading experts and researchers in the field of fertility, and then we'll be having a Q&A session at the end of those talks. This is a forum that's in its 5th year, and it intends to provide you with research findings from the experts that I've just mentioned, guiding you on how to conceive and have a healthy baby in today's environment. And I actually posted this on my social media account. I said to people, you should come along and see Making Babies in the 21st Century. And some of them responded quite smartly with, don't you just have to have sex? And of course, I was like, yeah, very funny. As you know, there is a lot more to it than that. And we're very fortunate to have our researchers here today to be able to bring us up to speed. Before we go any further, particularly for any of you that are pregnant in the room, there are toilets that you can go to at any time, which are located outside the main doors there. There's also a toilet in this little corridor here if you would like to pop down into that bathroom. Also, too, I'd like you now to turn your phones off. Well, not off, actually. Keep your phones on. But if you could turn your phones to silent, that would be very much appreciated. With our Q&A today, we are going to do it electronically. So if you have any questions when our speakers are standing up here at the stage, I'd like you to tweet them if you could, if you are on Twitter. The hashtag, it's an easy one to remember, hashtag Making Babies. So have we all got that one? Hashtag Making Babies. If you aren't on Twitter, and that's okay, it's a beast, you can just text your question through to 0475 if you've got a pen, if you'd like to write this down, or perhaps just punch it into your phone, 0475 788 461. That's 0475 788 461. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land that we are meeting on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we acknowledge and respect their connection to place, both past and present. If there's an emergency, please don't look to me because I'm not very good in an emergency. There will be some sort of loud, very, brand new, technical, lovely new building alarm that will go off. And hopefully lots of minions will run out and just guide you out of the building. But I'd just say run as fast as you possibly can out onto North Terrace. So I'll just give you that hashtag again, hashtag Making Babies, and the phone number 0475 788 461. Don't ring that phone number because no one will answer. Just send us a text message. All right, are we ready to be informed? Yes, Amanda, we are. I can feel it. Everyone's brains are just tuned on to hear from our first presenter. Louise Johnson is her name. She is the CEO of the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Treatment Authority, which administers aspects of the Assisted Reproductive Treatment Act 2008, conducting public education about the causes and prevention of infertility and treatment. She has an honours degree in science, postgraduate qualifications in education and management, and a master's in regulatory studies. The title of her talk this afternoon, Your Fertility Potential, Helping People to Conceive and Have a Healthy Baby. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Louise Johnson.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Delighted to be here. Today I'm going to talk about your fertility potential, helping people to conceive and have a healthy baby. I think everybody's heard about some of the factors that impact on our health, such as weight and smoking and alcohol and other lifestyle factors, but not many people know that these type of factors and the age of both men and women, and whether you know much about timing and the right time of the month, that all of these sort of factors can impact hugely on infertility and fertility, and roughly about half of infertility could be avoided if we could get our timing right and perhaps lose a few kilos if that's an issue for us, give up smoking and adapt our lifestyle. In 2011, we thought about applying for funding to get information out to the general public, and we worked very much in partnership with the Robinson Research Institute. Professor Rob Norman, who's speaking here tonight, and I put our heads together, and we worked together with Jean Hale's Women's Health and also Andrology Australia to apply for funding from the Commonwealth Government to get this sort of information out to the general public. And one of the most important messages is that the time before conception is incredibly important, and that can have a huge impact, not only being able to conceive and have a healthy baby, but also impact on the health of that baby into adulthood as well. So as well as those main partners that we've worked with, the most main organisations, we've also partnered with 16 other organisations to get our information out, including the Quit campaign throughout Australia, various family planning organisations such as Family Planning Victoria and New South Wales that produce information for schools, teachers and health professionals, but also Practice Nurses Association and other bodies as well, so that we can disseminate our information. I want to tell you a little bit about what we can provide and some information that you might like to look at later. On our website we have an ovulation calendar, and when we did a telephone survey very early on in 2012, we found that 2/3 of Australians didn't really know enough about the fertile time of the month. And so what we've done is to produce an ovulation calendar and information about fertility, such as interviews with practice nurses who explain how that the period, the couple of days before ovulation, is really the key time for fertility. And I think, as young adults, we spend a lot of time trying to prevent pregnancy and taking contraception all throughout the month, just in case. But it's really those key days leading up to ovulation that are really the most important time. And a number of health professionals have acknowledged too that they don't know enough about this information as well. So it's not just the general public. So there is information such as quizzes, there's fact sheets, videos and animations, and a range of information that you can access to enhance fertility. And we've got information not only for women but for men too. We think it's really important that men should be part of the conversation. So often when it comes to reproductive health, men aren't included in the conversation. And we did some focus group research with young men and women, and when we talked about the term fertility, a number of young men said to us, but that's women's business. If you want to use that word in communicating with us, you find another word, because fertility, we think about that as being women's business. So we want to do some work in the next 3 years to really try and reach men, because we think men should be empowered with information just as much as women. One of the tools that we've worked on in partnership with the Robinson Research Institute is an interactive tool called Gauge Your Fertility Potential. And what you can do is plug in all of your information, your height, your weight, how old you are, whether you've had a baby before, and various other information, and work out whether your potential can be enhanced or reduced by just changing your lifestyle a little bit. And really, doing something about lifestyle is a fine-tuning exercise. We know it's tough to try and lose weight. It's one of the great challenges that everybody's facing, and it's a population health issue. It's not just an individual issue. But we also know that sometimes just losing a few kilograms can make all the difference between conceiving or not. So you can play around with the figures and play around with this tool and see how that changes things. We're going to be doing some work the next couple of years to enhance this tool, and we're really looking forward to that. It's quite an exciting initiative that we're working on in partnership with the Robinson Research Institute. This is a bit of a close-up of the tool. In this instance, you can see that I've plugged in some information about smoking and regular alcohol use, and it shows you that if you change those numbers, if you say reduce your level of smoking, the indicator will move as you change your figures. And smoking is one of those factors that does affect fertility. But the good news is that if you give up smoking, your health returns and your fertility potential returns, as does many of the health effects of smoking can be repaired by quitting, and within 12 months things are a lot better. One of the things we've done is work with health professionals to produce information for the general public, and we've left some of the information out on the front there. So if you didn't get a chance to grab some information before you came in, please help yourself to some of this information after the lecture. So one of the things we've developed that I wanted to tell you about is a preconception health checklist. So there's the questionnaire that you can fill in on the website, and you can take that information to your doctor and talk about your fertility and interest in conceiving, if that's something that you want to do. You might also like to look at some of our fun animations. We've produced some information in a light-hearted way, as well as having serious information in the form of fact sheets. One of the aspects for many people who are having trouble conceiving is that there's some underlying problem that may be a factor. And we know that Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome, PCOS, sexually transmitted infections, conditions such as endometriosis, whether or not you have diabetes, there may be some genetic issues. All of these factors can also have an impact on fertility, and certainly we'd encourage you to talk about those sorts of factors with your doctor if that's something that affects you. And there's information on this website about all of those things as well as links to other websites with more detailed information. One of the things I want to highlight today, this week is Fertility Week, and each year we produce information and communicate that to the general public via the media and a range of different strategies to get information out in lots of different ways. And this year we're focusing very much on chemicals in the home, everyday chemicals in the home. And up until now there hasn't really been much publicity about the impact of everyday chemicals. And we know that there's been a lot of work with animals, and there's increasing evidence that everyday chemicals can also affect people and have an impact on time to pregnancy, for example, or an impact on the eggs and the sperm that are the key ingredients to develop an embryo. So we've collaborated with a researcher from Melbourne University, Dr. Mark Green, to produce some information that we're publicising this week. And one of the key ingredients in some of our everyday products can disrupt some of what they're called endocrine disruptors, and what they can do is interfere with hormones in the body and have an impact on our eggs and sperm. I'm not going to go, I haven't got time today, and I understand one of our other speakers is going to touch on this topic. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I want to highlight that there are some very positive things that people can do to reduce their everyday exposure, and it's very simple things like washing fruit and vegetables before you eat them in case they've been coated with or sprayed with chemicals, eating fewer processed and pre-packaged foods. There are some endocrine disrupting chemicals in the very, very soft plastics that sometimes coat the packaging of foods, such as Glad wrap and so on, the inside of cans and so on. So if you want to heat up your food, the best thing is to heat it up in another sort of container, not in a tin can, not in a soft plastic container that you might obtain with takeaway food, but to move it to something like glass or a ceramic bowl. Avoid handling shiny sales receipts, those receipts that you get, those soft shiny ones can also have chemicals on them, so minimise that. Drinking from glass and hard plastic bottles rather than very soft ones can make a difference. And avoiding strong chemicals, air fresheners, smoke and heavily perfumed products. Because if something is heavily perfumed, that can be an indicator that there's a range of chemicals in the product. Airing your home frequently, replacing strong household cleaning products with green alternatives, and everyday products such as shampoos and conditioners, for example, will often have on the outside that they contain chemicals called parabens, for example. So you can look for paraben-free shampoos and conditioners, and they're now widely available in many places. So you can choose personal care items that are free of some of these products. And we'd encourage you to have a look at some of our information on the website and also out the front.
Did you know that infertility ranks as a significant global health issue? That's where your fertility comes in. Our website is an interactive, evidence-based resource designed to give Australians all the facts they need. Fertility Optimization starts by both men and women being informed about factors affecting their fertility, including the age when their fertility declines and knowing when it is the best time during a woman's menstrual cycle to have sex in order to make a baby. The good news is fertility outcomes can be improved. 50% of fertility problems can potentially be improved through adequate planning and healthy lifestyle changes, like managing a person's weight, reducing alcohol consumption, and quitting smoking. These are the factors people need to know to improve their chances of getting pregnant naturally and avoiding medical interventions such as IVF. For more information, visit yourfertility.org.au. Your Fertility, leading the way in fertility information.
Thank you. Just before I finish, one of the factors I didn't talk very much about is age. And when we did our research through telephone surveys, we found that most men and women most men and women underestimated by about 10 years when fertility starts to decline. And for many of us, age isn't something that we can do much about. You know, we mightn't partner at an ideal time when we want to have babies. But sometimes even bringing the decision forward by 6 months, 12 months can make a huge difference in relation to trying to conceive. So for women, women's fertility starts to decline in the early 30s and in a more exaggerated way after 35. And for men, we know the time to pregnancy is much longer if the male partner is in their mid-40s or over. So certainly male age as well as female age can be a factor when you combine the two things together. So I'd encourage you to have a good look at our website and have a look at some of our materials. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. I've got lots of questions for Louise when we have our Q&A session, a lot of them around the age factor. I think that's very interesting, and why we don't seem to be aware of our fertility as much as we should. Just remember, all through the talks, if you do have a question for our speakers, hashtag making babies, or that phone number again, 0475 788 461. You don't have to be identified, by the way, with those questions if you've got it, and that's why we're keeping it nice and anonymous. If you do have a question, please, this is your time to get it answered by some of the leading researchers in this field. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome a man up onto the stage who just tells it like he is. He is magnificent and widely respected. He is the medical director and an active reproductive medicine specialist at Fertility SA, as well as being a research leader and previously the inaugural director of the Robinson Research Institute. His major research contributions have been in IVF and reproductive endocrinology, particularly in PCOS, the effect of lifestyle on reproductive outcomes, and the periconception medicine. His chat today is, and would you like IVF with that? Can you please welcome to the stage Professor Rob Norman, AO.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I've got 3 declarations. One is I do work for a fertility clinic, but I'm not going to sell that to you. Secondly, I'm going to use emojis, which some of you may find interesting, but they may be construed to be offensive, and I apologise for that. And the third thing is I'm not going to present you any real tables or detailed research, but everything I say tonight is based on research that we've done in the Robinson or we have evidence for in the literature. So I'm going to give you a general talk, but it's all hopefully true. Okay, so we have Jane and John. Jane is 35, John's 42. They met in the workplace. They were friends for about 3 years, and then they moved in together. So they've been together for 5 years, and they were on the pill, and she stopped the pill 18 months ago. They haven't really been trying to get pregnant, but they haven't been using any precautions. They're really healthy lifestyle, go to the gym frequently, don't smoke, no alcohol other than weekends. But they're really busy and they're quite stressed. And they've reached a stage where they sit down and have a meal together and they say, it's 18 months and nothing's happened, what do we do? So I'm going to talk about Jane and John tonight and find out whether you think they should wait or whether they should go and get some advice. And is the advice going to be IVF? Because if you listen to the radio, all 4 IVF clinics are advertising, come to us and we'll get you pregnant. Does that mean they're going to give you IVF? So, Jane and John at workplace are very separate. They're just good friends. When they move in, they use the pill. And no baby is designed, and so no baby turns up. However, when they've stopped, they expect that a baby's going to turn up. So what happens now is the situation is there's no baby, despite doing everything properly, and they think they're pretty healthy and all's well. So the big decision that this couple has to make is one that many people have to face, is do I wait longer and wait for nature to take its course because she's only 35, or do they go to their GP, who may or may not know something about infertility, or do they go to one of the IVF clinics straight off to get advice? So how common is infertility? We've got very good information from 100 years ago when people got married in their 16 or 20, never used contraception, and we've got really good information that shows how many of them never had a baby. And if you look at this, less than 10% of people in a natural situation, no contraceptive, had infertility. And most of that would be fairly obvious infertility. Now today is totally different. People don't really want to have a baby until they're over 30. There are many, many lifestyle things that have changed. People use contraception. But when we hear this figure that 1 in 6 people have got infertility, that's not a biological infertility. This is biological infertility. So a lot of the infertility that we see is age-related, or it's related to lifestyle or circumstances or whatever. So, should this couple go to their GP and get advice from their GP, or should they go straight to a fertility clinic where they'll see a specialist who's a fertility specialist? They went to their GP, and their GP was one of the really good GPs around, who checked the sperm, showed that ovulation was occurring, tubes were open, all the blood tests were fine, there was no lifestyle or genetic factors. So again, the couple face a decision. Do we go to a fertility clinic, or do we wait a little bit longer? So the GP talks to them about age, and the left-hand diagram shows the effect of age on the chance of getting pregnant. And the top figure shows if she'd had a baby before, Jane shouldn't really worry because it's probably going to happen. But if she hasn't had a baby before, by 35, the fertility is dropping. Right-hand side is something that most people don't think about, is male age. And he's 45, or should we say 42, he's on the way out. And you'll see that his fertility is dropping, and his chance of producing a miscarriage in his partner is much greater. So age is important. The next thing the GP talked about was, how many children do you want in your family? Because you've got great figures on what your chance is of having 1, 2, or 3 babies, depending on your age and whether you're trying to get pregnant. So if you want a 90% chance of having 1 baby in your family, you've got to start by 32. However, if you're prepared to take odds of 75 or 50%, you can wait a bit longer. So even at 41, you've got a 50% chance of having a baby. But if you want 2 children in your family, the GP said, you've got to start by 27. Now, it's long gone for them, but she's round about 34 now. So they have to take chances that it's going to take longer. If you want 3 kids, you should have started by 23, and you're past 31 now. So the chances of you having 3 children are down quite a bit. So they have to make up their minds. How many children do they want in their family? Because if it's only 1, they shouldn't really worry too much. But if they're wanting 3, they need to get on with it quickly. Then the next question is, how do you want to make this meal? Do you want it to be natural at home under best circumstances? Or do you want to go to the reproductive restaurant where the waiter will produce a reproductive menu that you can choose from? You can choose the price, when you want it done, it would be beautiful surroundings, everyone would be nice to you. Or do you want to do it at home? And so there are some restaurants where you just get fries with that, and there are others where you get really nice food. So you've got a bit of a choice if you go to the reproductive restaurant, what type you go to. So what are the options for fertility? Well, let me use an illustration of a car. If your car packs up, it may be something simple. It could be a $10 job, but it could be the whole engine needs fixing. Now, if you go to the mechanic that you trust, you're going to get the right advice and the cheapest option. But if you go to a shonky mechanic, they may want to change your whole engine just to sort out the carburetor. And so trust in fertility is really important, and this is one of the things they had to work out. Do we trust the GP? Do we trust the fertility clinic? Are we going to get lots of injections? Are we going to have IVF? So in fertility, there are a range of options depending on a person's circumstance. It may just be giving advice on intercourse timing, which we've heard about. There may be a diagnostic procedure that might pick up endometriosis or something like that. Maybe they're not ovulating and just simple tablets will do it. Maybe they can get away with just putting the washed sperm up inside the womb, intrauterine insemination. Or maybe they need something complicated like IVF. So this is where you don't need the shonky mechanic. You need the trusted doctor to tell you what to do. So let's see, when is IVF really needed? Well, it's seriously indicated if the sperm's really bad and can't be fixed, if the tubes are blocked, if you've been going at least 2 years without anything happening, if you've got some significant genetic problem, or if you need donor sperm or donor eggs. You might need it if it's been less than 1 year, maybe if you're 39. If you've got a low egg reserve, possibly. If you have marginal sperm, or if other treatment hasn't worked. So for this couple, they probably fit in between the two. So what are the options that Jane and John have got if they decide to have IVF? Well, they may be offered sperm injection. Usually you only use that for poor sperm. They might be offered genetic screening of the embryo, so the best embryo goes back and more likely to get pregnant quicker. You might have your embryos monitored, and Deirdre's going to talk about this, I'm sure. And you might be offered a whole lot of adjuvant therapies, and if you go to your naturopath, Jane and John are going to give even more advice than this. So I'm just going to come to the end. What things are Jane and John going to decide in a good fertility team if they're going to get advice, i.e. to go to a reliable group? Well, you need expert doctors. These are people who've been well trained in the area. You need great nurses and possibly embryologists if that's needed. There needs to be appropriate investigation and advice, and there needs to be outstanding results and care. So Jane and John decided to go for IVF, and they actually ended up with their 2 children when they wanted it. So what do we need to offer to the community? Well, I believe if the general practitioner is really good, they're the key to everything. So the patient's always got to be in control. Jane and John have to be in charge of their destiny, and if they do it with their GP, he or she is the advocate, will sort them out and help them and decide where they're going to go. They may need allied health, they may need counsellors or psychologists or dietitians. They may need a fertility specialist, but it could be an endocrinologist or gynecologist. And they almost certainly need reliable resources, which is what your fertility offers. So just to summarise for Jane and John, when they're looking at IVF, well, start early. Don't go back onto contraception. Maybe give nature a little bit more time, depending on how many children you want. Trust your GP if they're interested in the area. Get really serious, good quality advice from a reputable group of people. Always question your management. Don't just accept anything that happened. If they're going to do IVF, they need to really be sure that they need it and that they're not just being pushed it by a shonky mechanic. They need to get the best advice from the best doctors, and then they need to hang in there. And nature's pretty good. It usually solves the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Can I ask a question? Just a quick question. You know, with Jane and John, you know, they move in together, they think they quite like each other, and then, I don't know, maybe he burns the scrambled eggs or something, and she decides she doesn't like him and wants to go back on the contraception.
Yeah.
And you said, don't go back on the contraception. Obviously, I get that for chemical reasons, etc. But what about condoms? If you're going to go back on contraception, if you are unsure, because obviously wherever possible you do want to try and make sure you are having a child with someone that you like. It always helps. So condoms are okay?
So there's a huge amount of data about people stopping the pill and how quickly they get pregnant and comparing it to condoms. And it's exactly the same.
Oh, is it?
There's just a small group that take longer. But basically, you should be fertile really quickly after stopping the pill. So it's preference. Condoms are fine, pills fine as well.
Okay, all right, there you go. Thank you very much, Professor Rob Norman. Are we ready for our next speaker? And please keep those questions coming. Joining us now is Dr. Deirdre Zander Fox. She is the Regional Scientific Director for the Monash IVF Group and is responsible for clinics in Australia and Malaysia, including Repromed. She is a visiting research fellow and lecturer at the University of Adelaide. With an interest in optimising scientific technology, she was instrumental in designing and implementing implementing new laboratory protocols that significantly increased pregnancy rates and was awarded the FSA BFS Exchange Award at the World Congress of Human Reproduction. Her title today is Inside the IVF Lab, What's Hot and What's Not. Please give a big round of applause for Dr. Deirdre Zander Fox.
All right, so thank you very much for having me here to speak today. I had to say, same as Rob, obviously I do come from an IVF clinic and I'm not going to be promoting any aspects of it. What I'm really going to be talking today is about how the IVF laboratory, I think, is an absolutely miraculous place. It is where miracles happen, and how much technology has changed over time, what is happening in the laboratory, and then what's maybe on the horizon. So this is my only graph. I'm just going to mention the fact that the approximately 5.4 million babies have been born worldwide from IVF technology. That's the latest data from 2016. So it's obviously an incredibly important technology and is helping couples, obviously achieve their dreams. Huge numbers of IVF cycles are performed across the world. Places like America, normally around just under 180,000 cycles a year. Australia, around 70,000 cycles per year. And then, of course, there's other countries like China where there's astronomical amounts of IVF happening. We just really don't have very good data. So obviously, the approximation is 400,000 IVF babies being born annually. So it's a very important medical, technology. So as we've gone through since the birth of the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, in 1978, there's been a lot of changes in the laboratory and a lot of research to understand how vulnerable that embryo is to what we are doing to it outside of the human body. And each time we have reset what we consider is the ultimate goal from IVF. So obviously each little milestone, ability to fertilise and grow embryos, was amazing. Then be able to achieve a positive HCG, positive sac and fetal heart. At the conference I was just at, one of the doctors said whenever they had this happen, they'd have a party. Now we have this happening 20, 30 times a day. And obviously the birth of a live baby live birth is what we're going for. But the new and reset goal is really a singleton live term healthy baby. And that's really important. And that's where the laboratory is, I think, quite critical. This is Louise Brown at her birth with Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe, who were the grandfathers, I guess, of IVF. And this here was Louise Brown Incubator. So it looks incredibly basic, like something out of the Stone Age. It was basically a desiccator of which they would be able to pump in some gas to get the pH of the media right. And then it must have gone into some sort of oven or warming incubator to keep it at 37 degrees. So this is how we created it, or the first baby was ever created inside this incubator. And this is inside the IVF laboratory now. So these are state-of-the-art facilities. This is the modern incubator, an example of a modern incubator here, which is a time-lapse incubator, which Rob alluded to. All of these incubators now are tightly regulating temperature and gas to make sure that that embryo is kept in as optimum condition as we can, that there's no light inside, we keep the oxygen down, the air quality is the best it can be, and of course these incubators that are constantly monitoring embryo development, taking images every 5 minutes so that we can sort of, see how the embryo is developing. So this forms time-lapse videos, and this is the video that a patient can get of their embryo developing, and then obviously if it results in a healthy live birth, it's baby's first video. So this is how far technology has come. Now, time-lapse incubators, there's not a lot of real strong scientific validity around the use of them, but obviously they're state-of-the-art. This is what patients can get, so obviously technology has moved in leaps and bounds. The first culture media. So when embryos were first being created, there wasn't a lot of understanding about what the embryo needed, so they would have to use something that they had available, and often it was a somatic cell culture media. So the culture media they were just using to grow cells for research. Often, sometimes these culture media were made in laboratories by scientists. There wasn't often the best quality control, the quality of the water that they used, the oil that they overlaid the media with was often a research grade oil. So obviously that was where we were, and this is where we are now. So we have commercial companies manufacturing culture media that is specifically designed for the embryo and modelled on the what is happening inside the reproductive tract.
Okay, don't have a PhD, did about year 9 science. What is media?
Media media is what we grow the embryos in. So it's the fluid that the embryo is bathing in, sitting in there growing. So it is mimicking the reproductive fluid that sits in the uterus. But it basically just means we understand a lot about the embryo and we now know what it needs so we can feed it properly. We also are now able to cryopreserve or freeze embryos so that patients can use it later. We used to use this very old dated technology that really only resulted in 50% of the embryos surviving and really quite low pregnancy rates. So this was not optimal at all. We now freeze these embryos. We can remove all the water and put cryoprotectant in, which is just like antifreeze, like you'd have in your car, radiator. And it will turn the embryo to glass. And when that happens, the embryo is completely frozen in time, and in theory, it can then sit there forever and then can be thawed and will hopefully result in the birth of a healthy baby. And the pregnancy rates are equivocal to fresh. And I just want to mention that's so important for patients who have excess embryos, who may want to try and preserve their fertility if they haven't met the right partner yet and they'd like to freeze their eggs, or if they're undergoing oncology treatment as well. Obviously very important to try and preserve their fertility. Genetic testing, Rob alluded to genetic testing. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about what it is, but the early ways of doing this were incredibly inaccurate. We were probably discarding embryos that were normal and were okay for use. And the whole process of this genetic testing actually resulted in decreased pregnancy rates, which was completely, the opposite of why we were doing it. So we don't do this anymore. But what we do now is we're able to biopsy embryos, remove a couple of cells from that embryo and work out whether or not it is affected by a chromosome disorder. So whether or not it's highly likely that embryo will result in a Down syndrome pregnancy, or whether or not the parents are possibly carrying a genetic disorder like Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis, or carrying the BRCA gene. So we can diagnose this in the embryo, just remove a couple of cells from the cell layer that goes on to form the placenta, work out if that embryo is healthy or not, and if it's not healthy, we can not transfer it. If it is healthy, it'll help improve live birth rates for those parents and have a healthy live birth, which is what our aim is. That's just removing about 4 cells from the edge of the embryo, which can then be genetically tested. So obviously, IVF is now considered routine medical practice. We have amazing things in the laboratory. We can video embryos. We can tell whether or not they're healthy inside with their genetics. But there's a lot of things that IVF can't fix. And as Rob alluded to, there are some serious things that some patients have. If the man is not producing any sperm, we can't fix that at the moment. If the egg quality is really poor, we can't repair that. If a woman has gone into premature ovarian failure where her egg reserve is that of a 40-year-old but she's only 20, we can't fix that. Embryos do funny things where they'll grow abnormally, and there's nothing we can do about that. Or if they have a chromosome error, there's a lot we still can't fix. There's so much research that still needs to be done, but we have come a really long way. So we're doing a lot of research in this area, and the embryology laboratory, probably in 20 years' time, is again going to look completely different. We're trying to do a lot of work and trying to non-invasively look at that embryo. So instead of having to take cells off, we're trying to do it without touching the embryo. We're trying to create eggs and sperm from normal everyday cells, which is absolutely amazing, especially if you don't have many eggs left or if you're a man and you're not making sperm. And we're also trying to work out ways to fix genetic issues in eggs and embryos. So instead of just picking the ones that are normal, if they're there, trying to repair the ones that might be abnormal. And this is just an example of this technology where they've made glow-in-the-dark cats. And I think this is incredible because they glow in the dark. And to do this, they've put in a gene, and it doesn't matter what the gene is, they've put in a gene and tagged it with this green fluorescent protein. And these cats now glow in the dark because they've successfully put a gene into that embryo. So if we can do the same thing in humans, we can cut out a gene that's defective, put in a new gene, it'll mean we're able to fix things like Huntington's cystic fibrosis. So obviously we've come a long way, but there is so much more to go. But I think in 20, 30 years, it's going to be a really exciting time. And I'll leave it there.
Oh my God, that is so exciting. Can we please put our hands together for Deirdre? I want to glow in the dark.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Can you turn me into a glow-in-the-dark parent at 48 so I can scare my children so they can go to sleep? It would be so nice. Okay, let's go to our next speaker. Glasses on. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting, Deirdre. I hope you've all got questions for our speakers. Dr. Renee Fernandez is our next speaker. She is an early career researcher within the Life Course and Intergenerational Health Research Group in the Robinson Research Institute. She recently completed her PhD with the Dean's Commendation for Research Excellence for her research piece, Consequences of Female Night Shift Work for Fertility, Assisted Conception and Fetal Development. And just as an aside, also, who can be bothered having sex when you've been on night shift for a couple of weeks? So I hope you included that into your research piece as well. This work involved a series of I'm not even going to attempt it, studies examining the consequences of women's night shift work for infertility and reproductive outcomes. Her title today is Shift Work and Women's Fertility. Please put your hands together for Dr. Renee Fernandez.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to try and summarise what is quite a complex topic, shift work and its impact on infertility. I will cover what is shift work and who does it, how could shift work affect fertility, what we know and what we don't know, and what might we do about it. So shift work is normally defined as non-standard working hours, so outside your typical 9 to 5 day. There's different types of shifts, morning, afternoon, evening, night. There's different patterns of rosters. You might do the same shift permanently or rotate through different types of shifts. And it's these night and rotating shifts that we are most interested from a health perspective. 14% of women in the Australian workforce do some form of shift work. Most of these are in the hospitality and healthcare industries. 41% do rotating shifts, and most are in their reproductive years, so less than 45 years of age. One of the key ways that shift work affects our health is through disruption of our circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are the physical, mental and behavioural changes that follow a 24-hour cycle, and they respond primarily to lightness and darkness in our environment. So this is kind of our innate biological clock that tells us when it's dark, it's time to sleep, when it's light, we're awake. So shift work and associated circadian disruption can have physiological effects on our health, including altering our hormone secretion, our immune function and our metabolism. There are also behaviours that change when we do night shift and rotating shift work. We're exposed to light at night, our eating patterns change, our sleeping patterns change, and there's also evidence that shift workers have poorer health behaviours such as poor physical activity, alcohol and smoking. And getting, I suppose, into the who has time to have sex, there's psychological and social factors that influence fertility. So there's stress associated with the poor work-life balance, work-family conflict, and work-time control. And all of these can have consequences for our fertility and reproductive health. It's important to point out, though, that not everyone tolerates shift work the same way or experiences these side effects. Some people can tolerate the physical, mental, emotional challenges of shift work and become long-term shift workers. It fits with their lifestyle, it fits with their personal circumstances, whereas others have a horrible time and will leave very quickly.
There is some research looking at factors that might be associated with this tolerance. Most suggest that males tolerate shift work better, and that's mainly due to women being more sensitive to sleep disturbances. Age, there's evidence both ways for young and older workers. Your chronotype, so that's whether you're kind of a morning person or an evening person, and people who are more on the evening side tend to tolerate night shift better, and also how flexible you are with your sleeping patterns. And as I mentioned earlier, your level of social support and personality can influence your tolerance. So to talk about what we already know on this topic, shift work is really hard to define and study in a large-scale study. And that's because there are so many different types. There are so many different roster patterns. Some people are doing 2 night shifts a month. Some people are doing it a week. So it's really hard to group these people together. And most of what we know does come from studies of nurses. And the comparison group is usually who work permanently during the day. And the information I'll cover today comes from a literature review that myself and colleagues published. In terms of actually looking at shift work and infertility, there has not much been done on that topic. So what I'm going to cover is what we know about menstrual disturbances, endometriosis, which are risk factors for infertility, what has been done on time to pregnancy, fertility treatment, and miscarriage. So as I pointed out, menstrual disturbances do not necessarily mean infertility, and they can be quite common in the population. There is some evidence that rotating shift work has a higher prevalence of menstrual irregularity. You can see in the table there, among days, it's about 13 to 17%. It increases to 23% among rotating shift workers, and then up to perhaps 36% among permanent night shift workers. And it's thought that switching sleep patterns might be associated with disturbances, and that if a woman experiences changes in menstrual function, that may indicate an intolerance to her shift type. Another factor that has received some research attention is endometriosis. Studies suggest that it's almost 2 times more likely among fixed and night shift workers, but that's only among some shift workers. It really looks like it's something to do with the duration of shift work. These women tended to be longer term shift workers. They also tended to have problems with fertility. So we don't know whether shift work is actually causing endometriosis. It's probably that it's an exacerbation of a disease that was already there. Time to pregnancy is quite difficult to measure. The studies have often looked at women who are pregnant and said, how long did it take you to get pregnant? So that means that there was a pregnancy or there was a baby, depending on whether these women were studied. And studies among shift workers suggest that there was no difference in the time to pregnancy, and when they were not more likely to have a time to pregnancy of greater than 12 months after accounting for age and lifestyle factors. So again, we really need more research on this to find out about those women who don't manage to conceive at all. There has been even less looking at fertility treatment, which might be another way to measure infertility. Among my own work, we found that women in occupations that are likely to involve shift work had 14% more likely to require infertility treatment to conceive. And a small study that was published recently showed that shift workers had a poorer response to ovarian stimulation when they did undergo treatment compared to day workers, but pointing out that there was only 36 women who did shift work in that study. Miscarriage is an outcome that has received quite a bit of work, and it appears that fixed night shift is the higher risk, with 25 to 50% higher risk versus day workers. For rotating 3-shift schedules, it's a little bit more conflicting, with some studies saying no difference, others saying up to 20% higher. And just to explain these in diagrams here, the Royal College of Physicians in the UK has created these that suggest that among every 100 recognised pregnancies, the background or expected rate of miscarriage is 12. However, when we look at fixed night shift workers, we expect an extra 6 miscarriages to occur. And you can see in the 3-shift schedule, it's about 1.5. So it does look like fixed night shift, which is actually a less common roster to do, but more risky. So just to summarise what we don't know yet, and there's a lot, some of the key things that we would really like to work on is how to identify tolerance, what makes someone able to adapt easily to shift work, what patterns of shift back are worse, and how long do you have to do it, what level of intensity of night shift work do you have to do. And for nurses, is it shift work or is it something else? So a lot of these studies have been among nurses. Nurses are exposed to many hazards in the workplace. It's also a very stressful job. And so we really need studies that focus on other occupational groups. And before we make any kind of strong recommendations about workplace policy or mandatory restrictions on shift work, we really need greater evidence and greater quality evidence before we can make those kind of recommendations. In the meantime, there have been some individual measures that aim to reduce the risk of circadian rhythm disruption. So wearing blue blocker sunglasses on your commute home to avoid being exposed to that bright daylight, prioritising sleep and recovery after your shift, on your days off, making sure you get to sleep quickly in a darkened room after night shift. There are also organisational measures, avoiding a rapid shift rotation, providing education on healthy lifestyle and sleep hygiene to employees, and self-rostering, which is a bit controversial because it's difficult in practice, and of course in the healthcare system we need to cover a 24-hour roster, and there's issues with fairness and sharing out those night shifts. But it could be a promising measure perhaps in susceptible individuals and those perhaps who are planning a family and are anxious or worried that they tolerate shift work poorly and that this may affect their fertility. Thank you.
Very important work, Dr. Renee Fernandez. That is absolutely sensational. Thank you so much for that. I found that really, really interesting. Our next speaker, our final speaker before we get to our Q&A is Dr. John Schenken. He is a biomedical research scientist at the Robinson Research Institute. His research focuses on understanding the fundamental biology of conception and early development, with a focus on the role of the female immune system in fertility pregnancy and the contribution of environmental factors to reproductive tract health. But wait, I've got to get to the title because then it would be unfair if I didn't. His title, How Everyday Chemicals Impact Fertility and Pregnancy. Thank you so much. Please put your hands together.
Well, thank you, Amanda. And just while this is getting loaded up, as Amanda mentioned, I'm going to talk to you all about some everyday chemicals and how they can impact fertility and pregnancy. And these are chemicals that it's more than likely most of us have actually interacted with at some point throughout the day today. So a lot of this early stuff here has already been covered beautifully beforehand, so I will go through this quickly. But we are now more and more recognising that our reproductive health isn't as simple as it may sound. And we know that individuals, and couples in fact, will suffer from infertility, from recurrent miscarriage, and from complications of pregnancy. And it's important that we develop an understanding of why these are occurring so that not only can we learn to treat them, but we can also work out ways in which to prevent them from occurring in the first place. Even amongst women that are able to go on and give birth to a child, not all babies are born equally. And this is in part contributed by the events that occur throughout pregnancy. These events can set the trajectory for lifelong health. And more we're even beginning to appreciate now, as Louise mentioned, that the events and the exposures of our mothers and fathers can influence our health and can influence the quality of their pregnancy. Most importantly, the health of both parents plays an important role in this process. And as you can imagine, each individual will be exposed to many different things throughout their lifetime, some of which will have no effect at all and others which may potentially have an effect. In particular today, I would like to focus on endocrine disrupting compounds. So these are compounds that we see in our everyday lives. And these are a broad range of chemicals that interact with the endocrine system, and they produce a range of adverse effects in individuals. And some of these adverse effects are in the reproductive systems of men and women. And they do this by mimicking our hormones. So there are both natural and artificial endocrine disrupting compounds. And these natural compounds often come from plant-based products like soy, like soy and alfalfa and flaxseed, for example. And these are becoming more and more common in our diets. Things like soy-based replacements for meat products and soy milk products are becoming more and more common. And when we look at the studies, they do have conflicting findings, but there certainly is evidence of an impact on male and female reproductive health. So should we be panicking? Well, the answer is no, we don't need to panic, because the amount of these that we need to consume is such a large amount to see an effect. Probably what is most pertinent is these artificial endocrine disrupting compounds that we see in our everyday lives. There are around 800 of these that are in everyday items. Things like pesticides, which we can see in our fruits and vegetables, and if we go to our garden sheds to get sprays to spray our weeds, they're present in these. Bisphenols and phthalates and other plasticizers are present within our canned goods. They're present in plastic products, our drinking bottles that we can get in the soft plastics, and on the lining of our coffee cups and receipts. These all contain endocrine disrupting compounds. As Louise mentioned earlier, parabens have got a lot of media attention lately, and this image at the top here on the left is from the Herald Sun article that Mark Green and Louise were contributing to. And these are present in a lot of everyday items that we have in our house. And we need to be conscious of what is in these items, and we can look for products, as Louise mentioned, which are paraben-free. But also heavy metals, smoking, pollution, and some of these can accumulate in some of the foods that we eat, like oily fish and fatty meats. What I think is most striking is that if we look within the population, and if we were to take samples from each individual in this room, the vast majority of you will have detectable levels of these endocrine disrupting compounds. Sounds very worrying, but the reality is the degree of exposure that we have varies depending on the jobs that we do, depending on the lifestyle that we lead, and the location in which we live. And just because we have a detectable level of an endocrine disrupting compound doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to have problems with our fertility or the health of our children. So how do they impact fertility and fecundity? How do they impact our reproductive health? Well, as I mentioned before, they mimic our hormones. They mimic estrogen, testosterone, and they can potentially have a negative effect on male and female reproduction. Now, there are limited human studies on this, and the reason for that is it's very difficult to determine a specific effect of the specific compound when we have such a complicated and a complex exposure to many different things. And we're often exposed to many different endocrine disrupting compounds in the environment. And one of the benefits of using animal models, like the picture I've got here of these beautiful mice, is that we can actually specifically look at the contribution of the specific compound, and we can use the information we generate from these studies to infer what may potentially be happening in the human. But ultimately, we still need to do more research. We still need to continue to develop an understanding of what is going on. What we do know, though, is that occupations like agriculture, like hairdressing, like mining, where individuals are exposed to higher levels of these endocrine disrupting compounds, do have links with reduced fertility. And if we look at people that go to fertility specialists and go to clinics to conceive, if they have higher levels of these endocrine disrupting compounds, they have a decreased chance of becoming pregnant. And that's why these clinics are taking this detailed lifestyle information from the individuals, so they can determine the potential factors contributing to the fertility issues, and look at, as Rob said, simple ways in which they may be able to improve your outcomes. What we do know from a very broad point of view is that endocrine disrupting compounds from a reproductive perspective can impact our hormone levels, They can decrease the quality of our gametes, of our sperm and our eggs. They can damage sperm, and in women they can alter menstrual cycles, increase the time it takes to become pregnant, increase our risk of miscarriage, and also lead to early menopause. From mouse studies, we can also utilise these to really understand what happens not only to the individuals that are exposed, but to their children and to their grandchildren. And some of these studies show that some particular exposures to mums during pregnancy can not only impact their children, but also their grandchildren. And certainly if we look at historical data, like diethylstilbestrol, which was used in the 1940s to the 70s to prevent abortion, miscarriage and premature labour, and was recommended in all pregnancies, and also is an endocrine disrupting compound, we can see that there are some negative effects that can transmit across generations. So mothers that were given diflunistilbestrol during pregnancy had increased risks of developing breast cancer, and the daughters also had increased risks of cancer, evidence of subfertility and pregnancy complications, and we don't yet really know the impact that this may be having on their grandchildren. So this is all very concerning, right? So what can we do? Well, we could pack up, we could move to the jungle, avoid everything, right? That's a possible solution, but it's not really feasible. It doesn't work for everyone. I know certainly I'd last about 5 minutes in the jungle. So there are very simple steps that we can take, as Louise was speaking about earlier, to reduce our exposure, and these can have a really major impact on our reproductive health. So when we're considering to start planning a family, we can take into account these potential steps we can take, and we can talk to our GP or we can talk to our fertility specialist to understand what we can do and how we can improve our reproductive outcomes. So things like our fruits and vegetables, wash them before consuming and buy from known and local sources. This reduces the intake of the chemicals that are sprayed on the plants. Our canned goods, we can eat fewer of these. We can eat fewer processed, canned or prepackaged foods, reducing the intake of some of the endocrine disrupting compounds that are present in these. Limit our intake of particular meats like oily fish and fatty meats, reducing our consumption of endocrine disrupting compounds that accumulate in the animals. The sales receipts can be a particular problem, and they're things that I think that we need to, as a community, talk about how we can better work around these, like using e-receipts, for example, because the coating contains BPA. And our soft drinks, our soft plastic bottles, we can, rather than using those, use glass or hard plastic to minimise our exposures. And as Louise mentioned, critically, some of our plastics that we heat food in, or our Glad wrap or our cling film, rather than using those, use china or glass bowls and cover with paper towel to heat up to avoid our exposures. And of course the parabens. Well, there are very simple ways to get around exposures to many things. And firstly, I guess, it's to be conscious of what we're consuming, what we're interacting with, and reduce the use of personal care products with high chemical concentration, and look for replacement analogues. But also be aware that they aren't necessarily safer. BPA-free, for example, can often contain BPF or BPS. So I'd like to quickly finish by talking about Chiasi and Muato, which I've probably pronounced incorrectly. And there are two reasons I'd like to talk about this. Number one, I like rhinos, and I think that reproductive biology can not only benefit humans, but developing an understanding can also benefit other species, including critically endangered species. But also because I think this really nicely illustrates how such a small little change can actually lead to a great impact. And so Chiasi was born at San Diego Zoo in captivity. And for 16 years, they tried to breed her, and they weren't able to get any successful breeding. And that's really concerning when you've got a species that is really critically endangered. And so the zookeepers and the researchers that were associated with this were trying to work out what could potentially be going wrong with Chiasi. Why wasn't she fertile? Why weren't they able to have any more rhinos that come through? And it turns out that the diet they were giving her was high in soy and alfalfa, and this has high levels of phytoestrogens, as I said before. So a very simple solution was just to change her diet, reduce the level of soy and alfalfa there. And as it turns out, by doing that, within 2 years of change of the diet, she was able to get pregnant. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And really what this highlights is what may seem like a small change may have a large impact. And that's the important thing here. It's not to be worried, not to be paranoid or concerned about the impact it may have, but just be conscious of what our exposures are and understand ways in which we can reduce them. And I'd just like to finish by acknowledging not only the Robertson, who I work for and is a fantastic institute to work with, and our specific lab group with Professor Sarah Robertson and our collaborators, but also I'd like to acknowledge what Louise mentioned earlier, and that is that the Fertility Society of Australia and Your Fertility have some fantastic resources that surround this topic, and you can really get some great information on them, and I believe some are out the front there today. So I encourage you all, if you're interested, to grab some of those to have a bit more of a look at it and find out more information. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You know what? I reckon we are all shattered in this room that we can't eat spam. When that came up, I thought, no. No, in fact, I've never known anyone in my whole life. Has anyone in here ever eaten spam? You have. You've admitted that. Okay, there's a few of you. All right, I was just going to say, I've never met anyone who's eaten spam. Now I have. Thank you, Robinson Institute. All right, could we please have our guests up on the red chairs? We have had quite a few questions come in, which is excellent. And you can continue to feed the questions in if something just springs to your mind. You can also, if you can't be bothered getting out your thumbs and texting or tweeting, you can just pop up your hand and shout it out to me, and we will try and get your question answered. All right, you're all there. We're missing one. Come on, Louise. She's coming up. She's texting. Are you texting a question into Rob or something, eh? All right, so I have got so many questions for each and every one of you, and also lots of great questions have come in from the audience. Deirdre, when you were talking, we had a question here for you. Is the modern genetic testing you're talking about the same as the Harmony test you can get in early pregnancy?
So the Harmony test is a test that is used when a woman is already pregnant, and it's used to work out at around the 10-week pregnancy mark whether or not her pregnancy is likely affected by a chromosome disorder. So the genetic testing that I was talking about is actually the exact same technology, but it's done before the embryo is put back into the patient. So it means we can diagnose it whether or not it has a genetic disorder and not transfer. So they are very similar technologies, but obviously the woman is already pregnant when you do the Harmony or non-invasive prenatal testing like Panorama or any other test.
There's a lot of questions I have for you, actually. Firstly, the first IVF receptacle looked like a Pyrex dish. I thought that was a ripper. So, another use for Pyrex. Excellent. But what I wanted to talk about is, I suppose, something that's more ethical, and I don't know who wants to answer this, but do you have many people coming in and wanting to have IVF technology or conceive a child through using IVF technology because they want to weed out any problems or they want to weed out any bad eggs?
I will answer, but I'm sure Rob will be able to.
Or is there a perception, I suppose, that you can do that?
Yeah, so obviously we can't use IVF and the technologies that we have available to ever select an embryo for any other reason other than to minimise the risk of having a child with a genetic disorder or a chromosome disorder. So we can't do any kind of sex selection just because you want a girl or a boy. We have to use these technologies to help a mother have a healthy pregnancy, not for any social reasons, no designer babies or anything like that. Do you want?
Yeah, I think we need to realise that an IVF baby is not better than a naturally conceived baby, and in some circumstances may not be quite as healthy. So IVF is a safety net, and if you've got a serious problem like very little sperm, you need to use that safety net really quickly. But if things are just not happening and everything else is normal, then that safety net may only come a bit later. So some people want to have a baby now. They want to conceive now because they want to get in the right zodiac sign, or they want to get the same birthday that they've got, or whatever. That's not really a good use of IVF, but that's not to say we won't do it.
Just another question on that. There's a lot of people that live in this world where they think that, IVF is just going to save them and they can freeze their eggs. You spoke about freezing eggs and how now with the technology that's been developed and is continuing to be developed, I think you said that the eggs can sort of stay in there forever and still be 100% healthy. But what about the age of the woman that's going to give birth to the child? I mean, there's all sorts of ethics around that, surely. I can't freeze my eggs at 24 and then decide at 55 or 60 that actually now's the time because I've paid off the mortgage, I've got a nice car, I'm ready to have a kid.
So obviously from a biological perspective, when we freeze eggs or embryos, we lower the temperature of them to minus 196 degrees centigrade, and at that point, metabolism stops. So the biological aspect of cryopreservation is you could in theory, the theory is that they are fine and they can be thawed whenever, but the ethical or the whether or not we should and whether or not we're allowed to is very different. And obviously we do have limits on when we can treat women and how up to what age they can access treatment. But obviously some countries don't seem to have that. There was a woman in New Zealand who had a baby in her 60s. So
God,
was it Rob?
I want to be on a cruise ship in my 60s, not breastfeeding, I can tell you.
There's one woman who had a baby at 72 and she was dead at 74. But I think these days people are really fit and healthy, and there's no reason why someone in their 40s can't carry a baby from, say, a frozen embryo. But there's nothing we can do to keep the ovaries going longer. The ovaries get older quicker than the rest of our cells.
Can I just add to that too, that there's a lot of hype in the media with celebrities having babies in their 40s, and what's often not disclosed is that donor eggs have been used to help to create those babies. So one of the things that was mentioned before is that IVF isn't a silver bullet for age-related infertility where the quality of the eggs is poor and they're very low in number. So it's one of those myths that IVF can fix those things. So it's certainly something to bear in mind. And with egg freezing, I know with one of the clinics in Victoria where women are freezing their eggs, that the average age of women freezing eggs is around about 37. And so these aren't young women that are coming in and freezing eggs. And we also know from some research that's underway that many of the women aren't coming back to use those eggs. And so it's quite a complex area.
Louise, while you've got the microphone, can I ask you, why is it that we don't seem to know about fertility as much as we should?
Look, I think we're trying to do something about that. But in school, we learn a lot about contraception and... Is that better?
Yep.
In school, we learn a lot about how to avoid getting pregnant, and I think that tends to be the focus. We learn about STIs and how to avoid those and how not to get pregnant. And not enough information is out there about how to optimise your chances if you do want to become pregnant, and if and when. And for those that really do want to have a child at some stage, that information is really important. And just even knowing, how the female body works and the fertile time is incredibly important whether you want to avoid the situation or go for it, really.
Because a lot of people don't think about it, do they, until they're in their 30s, and then as Professor Norman said, and I think all of our speakers have said, then you've got a problem.
We are
potentially.
Absolutely, and we are trying to do something. We're working with Family Planning Victoria. We've produced some materials for teachers, and we're going to be improving those in the next couple of years. So we're trying to get information into schools.
And it's probably important too that, all of us have a responsibility. If we do know about these fertility rates, and if we do know about when the optimal time is to start having children, we do have a responsibility to speak as loudly as we possibly can. And also too, if you want any help with your grandparents, you probably want to start having kids quite young. I mean, I had my first child at 36. I will be a pensioner when I'm still doing the school run, which is a bit tragic. But if I'm going to be around to have grandchildren or to help my children, they better be onto it in their 20s, I think.
And I think Rob made a really good point in relation to that.
If we do suggest when to get pregnant at school, as a teacher, science teacher, we get into too much trouble.
Yeah, well, we might have to find ways to work around that, I think.
Yeah.
There's a responsibility, I think. I think we all need to be more aware of it because, I've got a number of friends, I'm sure we all have, who are having a very hard time trying to have children late in their 30s. Just on that, maybe, Deirdre, this was a question I had when you were talking, but anyone can answer it. Can you test for premature ovarian failure?
So
when you're at 20 or 21 or something.
So there is a test on the market, there's a blood test that women can have when they're younger, which is a test for anti-Müllerian hormone, which is a bit of an indicator of ovarian reserve. So that test is available, but it doesn't seem to be. I've done lectures at uni and spoken about AMH, and no one at uni has ever heard of it. So I don't know how come that is, because it is a reasonable marker of ovarian reserve, and we'll let you know if you have a low ovarian reserve for your age, regardless of what age you are.
I think we need to emphasize the test doesn't tell you your fertility. You can have a really low AMH and still be incredibly fertile. It just tells you the number of eggs that you've got. And people get scared. You know, there's no reason to have IVF just because your AMH is low.
This is an interesting question. It's a comment, but then I'll follow it with another question. A 30-year-old and her contemporaries are very aware of the impact of age and fertility, but they're feeling very stressed about not being partnered, which leads on to another question that we've got from another person saying, is there a right time to freeze your eggs?
I think if you're going to freeze your eggs, you've got to do it as early as possible. And if you do it in your 20s, there's an extremely high chance that you'll never use them. You go through an expensive IVF procedure, freeze eggs, then you'll get pregnant with Mr. Right, who then turns up straight afterwards. The more eggs that are frozen at a younger age, the better the chance of getting pregnant. So if we've got someone who's got cancer and they're about to go through chemotherapy, which is very damaging to, well, some drugs are very damaging to the ovary. That's when we'd really get in and try and get as many eggs stored as quickly as possible before they go through chemo. But freezing eggs in the late 30s is not likely to be very successful. Freezing eggs in the 20s is likely to be successful, but the chance that you'll ever use them might be low.
This is a question for you, Renee. Shift work. Does shift work affect fertility in men, and do melatonin tablets help all shift workers?
There's been far less research about fertility in men, but the same pathways in terms of changes in behaviour, sleep disturbances, poorer lifestyles such as higher weight, smoking, alcohol are all happening in male shift work as well as female shift workers. And so I'd say it's likely that it could affect. And I think there was a study that was recently presented at a urology conference in America that showed poorer semen quality among male shift workers who attended fertility clinics.
When you were talking about shift workers, I started thinking about those first few years when I was having children and how I felt constantly numb from getting up in the middle of the night and breastfeeding and all of the other associated things that go on with having young children. Is that akin to being a shift worker, and would that affect the potential fertility of your subsequent children? You know, your sorry, not the fertility of your children. Would that affect your possible conception? Like, is that in the same basket as being a shift worker? Or have you ever thought about that? Or am I just asking stupid questions?
It's not a stupid question, but I think it's more than just the sleep. It's a combination of factors that are happening in shift workers that might put them to a limit that puts them into the subfertile category. So I don't think people who have children and are up at that type of thing would have to the same extent.
But it might have an effect.
But it might have an effect. And certainly women who are shift workers and have families, that can be cause a lot of conflict. And there is research that suggests that female night shift workers forego their daytime sleep to keep up with those household and caring responsibilities. So it's sort of doubly potentially.
Yeah, that's not good, is it?
There. Yeah.
John, I'll ask you a question now. I'm just nervous as all hell, actually, after watching your presentation. You were talking about, are there alternatives for everything out there? So could we live a life that's going to obviously guarantee our fertility a lot more? Or has the damage been done? If you were born in the 1980s or the 1970s, has the damage already been done?
Well, I don't think we should ever think of it in a way that the damage has been done and there's no turning back. I think that is not overly helpful. I think the story about Kiazi proves that we can really rescue things by making small changes. As for there being substitutes for everything, I can't really comment on all of that, but certainly there are increasingly more and more substitutes for a lot of these compounds. And, I think the general population is becoming a lot more conscious, not just about this in particular, but about what they're consuming. And we're a lot more aware of what is there. So I think if we keep that up and we become more aware of the components of the things that we interact with and that we consume, it'll really be helpful.
Apart from seminars such as this and doing talks all over the world, how is this information getting out to people who are wanting to get pregnant, or to all of us?
Well, I think, this fertility week, it's been absolutely amazing with Your Fertility and with, and Louise can comment on this as well, of course, Your Fertility and Mark Green, but there's been a huge amount of media coverage on these everyday chemicals that's been occurring this week. And I think more and more, the more people talk about it and the more people communicate about it and, develop an understanding of what impacts these might have, can only be beneficial for everyone.
I've got a question here, which is wonderful that someone shares my love of Tupperware, because they've said, how does Tupperware containers with the hard plastic compare? Are they doing okay? Is Tupperware safe? Oh my God, I hope to God it is, or I've got 3 drawers that have to be thrown out tonight.
I might pass it over to Louise because...
Louise, please tell me it's safe.
I think it depends when it was... Is that working?
Yeah, you've got to talk into the top.
Okay, is that working?
Perfect, that way.
Okay. With any plastics, including Tupperware, I think it really depends when it's manufactured. And when you're shopping for your hard plastics, on a lot of the hard plastics now, there's actual labels, and they tell you whether it's free of particular chemicals or not. But certainly one of the guides is that if a plastic is soft and malleable, then that's an indication that chemicals have been introduced to make it soft and malleable. So I think that's a good indication to not heat food up in it, like those takeaway containers that you get takeaway Chinese in, or whatever, or takeaway Indian. So depends how old your plastics are and when they were produced. I think there's a lot more awareness. There's a lot more plastics that are now have labels that they're free of various chemicals. And I know when I go into the chemist that there's more shampoos that say they're paraben free now. So I think if you just look for those labels, you can try and avoid your levels of exposure somewhat anyway.
And you obviously, if you do have children, you have to start that routine in the house as early as possible too, so as to not expose them to those chemicals, therefore potentially threatening their own fertility.
Yes, and I know in my own household I've thrown out all the old shampoo bottles, and particularly since we started doing this research in partnership with Mark Green and producing information for the general public, that I've thrown out all of my old shampoos that had all the nasties in them, for sure.
I was just thinking, you're a teacher, I was thinking when John was talking about the chemicals they use in schools. You know, you go into the toilets at the school and they've still got those horrendous urine blocks in the toilets, and I thought maybe we need to be talking on a bigger level about having all of our educational facilities start to be a little bit more healthy as well, if this is obviously, this research is coming back so positive. This is a question: how can we find out if we have endocrine disrupting compounds? Do we go to our GP?
One of the things we've done this week is get information out in the AMA newsletters for GPs so that they can be educated about these issues as well. And some of the health professionals that I've caught up with in the last couple of weeks have seen those articles, so I'm pleased about that. I think it's really important that we get information out to GPs as well as the general community so that they can have conversations with their patients too.
This is another one just on the chemicals, which has obviously sparked a bit of a nerve with a lot of people in here. How do you wash fruits and veggies? Is it a quick rinse under running water, or do you get out the gurney and hold them against the wall and spray them down and scrub them? How forensic do we have to be with our vegetable washing? Either one of you could answer that question.
Louise can add to this. Everyone's guilty of sitting there grabbing an apple and going, I really can't be bothered going to the sink to wash this. I've done it plenty of times and I probably should know a little better. But I think, as long as you're doing a relatively thorough wash, you don't have to sit there and scrub it till you've lost the skin on your apple and things like that. But as long as you're doing a good wash, you should be getting rid of, the vast majority of these chemicals.
And organic fruit is a bit more expensive than the fruit that isn't labelled as organic, but washing it certainly helps. So it doesn't need a huge amount of scrubbing, it's washing.
Okay. This is a question for you, Renee, I think. This is, have there been similar findings about miscarriages there? Oh, it might not be for you, sorry. Whoever wants to answer this. Have there been similar research findings about miscarriage as there is about fertility, age, lifestyle, etc.? So I don't know who wants to answer that one.
So the miscarriage rate goes up dramatically as the woman gets older, and it's to do with the quality of the egg and its ability to produce normal chromosomes. So from around about 36 years onwards, you get a big increase. And so if a woman gets pregnant at 44, she's probably got about a 50% chance of miscarriage. And that's completely unavoidable. That's genetic. There are other things that do contribute to miscarriage. They can include some drugs, they can include some hormone changes. These can be assessed by a competent doctor, and if they're preventable, they can be dealt with. What is not preventable is that if you are in a relationship with a man over the age of 40, even if you're 20, he's going to increase your risk of a miscarriage as well. So the male age has a very significant effect on miscarriage. So try and get someone your age.
Damn. There goes Rod Stewart. All right. So how about this one? This is an interesting one. This is a very interesting one, actually. All of you, or in fact, Rob, you and Louise focused on this quite a bit, where you were talking about finding a reputable doctor and someone that you trust. Now, I know, Rob, this is your big thing. How do you know? How do you know you've got a good doctor?
Well, whether you're dealing with a naturopath or with a GP or with a fertility specialist, there's going to be a range of training, a range of bias, and a range of financial incentives in that group of people. And so there are a lot of fantastic naturopaths around that are worth going to see, and it's probably word of mouth is the best thing to do that. GPs, I generally find that it's doctors who are interested in women's health issues. They're good on menopause, they're good on contraception, they're interested in fertility. So there are quite a lot of GPs around that are good at that. In terms of fertility...
But it's not like they have an Uber rating system that you can look at, though, is there?
No, in the US there's a TripAdvisor for all doctors, and you can actually go and see fertility doctors and work out who's popular and who's not. That doesn't mean they're a good doctor, but and it'll come this way, that there'll be people who are rated. In terms of fertility doctors, they tend to work in fertility units, and so the reputation of the unit's really important, because that doctor wouldn't be allowed to work there if they were poor. But there are some individuals who practice in very alternate ways, add large amounts of unproven therapies to fertility treatment, and they probably need a little more questioning.
Can I add to that it's really important when you're choosing a doctor that you choose somebody that can answer your questions and that you can have a conversation with them. And certainly there are specialty groups, as Rob mentioned, particular doctors that have an interest in women's health, for example, and take a particular interest in this area. And often they will have an interest and have a great appetite for reading about this particular area and referring you on to specialist help if you need it. But within clinics, there's quite a diversity of doctors, and it's really important to choose somebody that can answer your questions and that you feel comfortable with. We get a lot of inquiries at VARTA in Victoria from patients. And we encourage people to make sure that they ask the right questions. We've got tips and information on our website, the VARTA website, about assisted reproductive treatment, and there's a list of questions that you can ask your doctor in various places on that website. But also, if you're not happy to shop around, don't hesitate to see somebody else if you're not satisfied that your questions can be answered.
This might be a really basic question, but when you were talking about lifestyle factors, obesity, smoking, alcohol consumption, getting your diet, you might basically having a healthy life before you get pregnant, or that affecting your fertility, is that because it actually affects the eggs? Like, what is it? What would happen if I smoked, ate McDonald's every day and was 45 kilos overweight?
Well, there are lots of people like that who do get pregnant, and when we see patients, they always tell us, but those people I saw in the shopping centre, they weigh 180 kilograms and they've got 5 children. Why can't I, with 70 kilos, get pregnant? So there's a range of biological variation. By and large, there is an effect on the egg. So one of our researchers, Rebecca Robke, in the Robinson Research Institute, has shown that a high-fat diet gets deposited in the egg, and that leads to an egg that doesn't function properly and doesn't produce a good quality embryo. Smoking cuts down, it kills a lot of eggs, and it also damages the eggs that are left behind. Excess alcohol has a big effect on the embryo and the developing fetus. So there are lots of ways it can work. So it's either on eggs and sperm, or it's the environment in the womb in which the embryo is produced. So Sarah Robertson and others have used the term parenting before conception. We have a responsibility to be parents before we conceive so that we prepare for pregnancy.
And obviously it's the same with men, but is there something that you can do as a man that damages your sperm or makes your sperm an inferior quality, like maybe, I don't know, barracking for Richmond or something?
Yeah. Smoking is really bad for sperm. It really does damage sperm, and smokers take much longer to get someone pregnant, if at all. So that's something. Clearly, excess alcohol can have a very significant effect. Marijuana in large quantities has a big effect on sperm. And one of the things we see a lot of is guys who go to the gym who come to us with huge amount of muscle and no sperm, and they're on anabolic steroids.
Yeah.
So there are a whole lot of things that can affect sperm.
And Louise, you mentioned earlier that we are starting to talk more about men, that men don't necessarily feel, or they don't know that they're actually half of it.
Absolutely. A third of infertility problems usually relate back to men, a third women, and a third can be unexplained, or it might be a combination of a whole range of different factors. So men are definitely part of the picture. And when we did a telephone survey of Australian men and women a few years ago, we found that around about a quarter of the people that we surveyed thought that women were still sort of fertile up to the age of menopause. And as we've talked about tonight, women's fertility drops off in the 30s and dramatically.
And don't you have half your eggs or something? Don't you only have half your eggs left at 35?
So certainly it changes quite dramatically after then. And there's more and more information coming out about the impact of men's age too, and the combined age of men and women too. So it's important that we talk to men and get information to men as well as women, and that men know information about how fertility affects women as well as themselves.
Renee, you spoke...
Amanda, can I just say that in the past it was always the woman that was responsible for not getting pregnant. And as you know, throughout history they were cast off for the next
barren.
one. Barren. And these days most clinics will refuse to see a woman who says she's infertile without the male partner, if there is one, turning up. So we are very insistent that we see the male, that he has a sperm test, that he contributes to the discussion and the decisions, and that he's not just someone who's just on a bit of paper as existing and some lab tests. We want to see the guy and we want to talk to him.
Do those pills work, that they advertise on television where they say if you take these you have sperm that's so fit and amazing. If you take 3 pills a day, only $29.95 a bottle.
Yeah, so some men have what's called DNA damage or DNA fragmentation. This is where there are little nicks in the germline or the DNA in the sperm. And it's thought that some antioxidants, such as vitamin E, vitamin C, can repair that, and therefore fertility is better. There've not been good trials that conclusively show that you're more likely to get pregnant if you take one or get someone pregnant if you take those. And taking fruit and vegetables and vitamin E or vitamin C is just as good as getting expensive pills.
I've got another question here. There's been a lot of discussion on the effect of chemical and endocrine disrupting compounds and their effect on fertility. Is there any relevant research on how these things may affect the fetus, newborn or mother, i.e. intraveterine growth restriction, lactation and breastfeeding as some examples?
Sorry, can you just...
Yep, I'll read that again.
So I think I kind of got it. So it's basically whether there is any evidence that there's an impact on the fetus as it develops inside the mother.
Yeah.
My understanding...
Or on lactation, breastfeeding.
I'm not so familiar with any evidence on lactation or breastfeeding, so I can't really comment on that. But my understanding is that from particularly some of the animal studies, we can look at the impacts that these compounds have. And because there's such a vast amount of these compounds present in the environment, that we do see that they obviously have some subtly different effects, but there seems to be an impact on development throughout pregnancy and the quality of the pregnancy.
This is an interesting question and something that I've thought about too. Obviously, in the world of IVF or in the world of, obstetricians or just anywhere, we only really talk as a society about the good things that happen. We talk about the live births, we talk about the successful IVF treatment, the successful sperm donor, the successful egg donor. Do we talk enough about the things that go wrong?
Well, Deirdre can help me with this, but the things that go wrong is you don't get pregnant. So a proportion of people will never get pregnant, and we may not know why they don't get pregnant. People going to IVF need to be prepared for the fact there may be several cycles involved, because we only have an embryo back at a time. We can use frozen embryos, and it may have to be another stimulated cycle. So that's something that can go seriously wrong, that we just don't get a baby, and someone's got to decide when they're going to get off the treadmill. And that's where a good clinic will talk with them about the right decisions for that particular person. Other things that can go wrong, there's suggestion that some types of IVF might be associated with increased congenital abnormalities in the child. And the best work in the world has been done by Michael Davies here in Adelaide. What we're reasonably confident about is that the IVF procedure itself is not damaging babies. There's a little bit of suggestion that if the guy's got really poor sperm that's unknown origin, that if we're putting sperm injected into the egg, that we're transmitting whatever that unknown genetic disease is, and there may be increased miscarriage, congenital abnormalities there. The miscarriage rate doesn't appear to be increased. The congenital abnormality rate, by and large, is the same. And we have a lot of information about IVF babies. They seem to grow up to be just as a good IQ as anyone else. But we don't have a lot of kids who've gone beyond 20, so we need to see over the next decade whether we're going to get any problems.
And I'll just add on to that, like what I said before. There is a perception that IVF is a cure-all, and that if you can't conceive naturally, if you go to IVF, that will work. And unfortunately, like I said, we are still limited by some aspects of the technology where we can't repair poor quality egg or sperm. We can only work with what we have already. There are some aspects of embryo development that go really wrong, and we can't fix it no matter what we do. We can't correct if there's a chromosome error in the egg, which is often very frequent in older women, and in fact some women have 100% of their embryos have a chromosome error, and there is nothing we can do to fix that. Their only option is accessing donor programs. So it certainly, needs to be, I think, quite well understood that we are limited as well by the current research and technology that we have. It won't work for everyone.
Are there moves to make the donor programs easier to get eggs? Because it's my understanding that it's still quite difficult in Australia. Is it, or is that just rumour?
Well, because we have in Australia, it's altruistic donation only, so there is no payment for that. It is quite difficult. We have clinic recruited donors, and also patients are able to try and find their own egg donor who might be a sibling or a cousin, and we do have clinic recruited sperm donors who are doing it all altruistically, but it is definitely harder in Australia.
Can I just add to that? There are a number of... I can speak for Victoria because I know the data from Victoria quite well, but every year over 200 women donate eggs to other women for IVF treatment or donor insemination. So there are a lot of women out there who are prepared to donate to help other women. And many women advertise in some of the local newspapers, or they advertise in the newspapers that appear in childcare centres or various other local government facilities. And some people also join online forums and find an egg donor that way. And so there are a number of women that are prepared to donate. And sometimes it's about just letting your wider circle know that this is what you've got to do, and sometimes somebody just steps forward, and we provide tips and advice to people every day from where I work about how to find an egg donor, and many people are very successful in finding their own egg donor by using those strategies.
Thank you for that. Just another question. Does undergoing ovarian stimulation so that you can freeze your eggs reduce the chance of falling pregnant naturally? Can you take too many eggs and there's not enough left?
No, the average person, say, age 35, who's going through IVF has probably got 40,000 eggs still there, and we might get 10 or 20 for each IVF cycle. What people don't realise is that, say at 35, that your ovary is looking at 500 eggs that come forward and present themselves, and it chooses one egg naturally, and it kills off all the others. They're dead. They never come back again. So every month you're losing anywhere between 50 or 500 eggs naturally. So what we do with ovarian stimulation has absolutely no effect on the total number of eggs that are there. And you don't go through menopause early if you go through IVF.
That's another important question. Do we have any more coming from the floor, or should we make moves to wrap it up? Here we are. Do we have... Oh, this is a fun one. I don't care who answers this. Do we have any information about long-term effects for women having gone through IVF, specific relation to hormone therapy undertaken during IVF?
Right, there have been some good studies done in Australia following women up long-term and also overseas. And Michael may want to correct me on this, but my understanding is that there is no significant increase in ovarian or breast cancer, and no significant long-term physical effects for women. Depending on how the cycle's handled, there should be no psychological ill effect either.
What about postnatal depression? So I've had a number of friends who have gone through IVF and they've got a bit depressed after their child's been born, and they themselves have put it down to the fact that they were on IVF. Now, I don't know whether they're just looking for something to blame for it, but they have tried to connect the dots and said that because they were on so many drugs and they were nervous and they were tense and, much more nervous about the birth than this is what they thought, than having a natural conception.
There is research underway, and one of my colleagues, Karen Harraberg, did some early research in looking at women who'd been through IVF as well as women who hadn't, and their involvement in in places like sleep centres and so on to get help with sleeping babies and levels of stress. I think one of the things about IVF treatment, it is financially and emotionally stressful, and there's a huge amount of effort that goes into that, and certainly that's something that people really do feel. But the health, there's a number of studies that are following up the health of men and women after, you know, they've created their family and had a baby, and certainly the differences between those people that are going through IVF and those people that are having babies naturally, there haven't been huge differences that I'm aware of in the research that's published. Rob, you might want to add.
In Australia, you're much more likely to have a caesarean section if you've got an IVF baby. It's probably based on, would you disagree, Michael? Oh. So it's probably based on the doctor's fear of something going wrong, and these are often, in inverted commas, precious babies, so people worry a lot about them. But I do think the obstetric care sometimes is a little bit different and a bit more intense. Michael?
Do you want a microphone?
If you're going to record,
Come down the front, Michael. Well, if you can come on camera. Professor Michael Davies, Professor in the Robinson Institute. Here you are. There, you got that one.
Thank you very much, and sorry to interrupt the proceedings. A quick comment on the link with cancer. There was a study published in The Lancet in 2001 by Alison Venn, who was then in Melbourne, showing that there was a transitory increased risk in breast cancer in the 2 years after a treatment cycle. And it was proposed that this could be due to exacerbating some possibly a pre-existing tumour through the exposure to the estrogenic substances that were used for ovulation induction. There was also, in recent years, a very high-quality registry study that came out of Denmark using a whole population for Denmark, showing that it was presented at ESHRE, a very large European meeting, and that person was in turn given a prize for that work and brought out to Australia to present at the FSA. Her name was Marie Hargrave. And in that work, she was able to show that using registry data, there was an increased risk of all cancer, total cancer, but then also a couple of specific types of cancer, both in the child and in the mother who was exposed to the estrogenic drugs for ovulation induction. So that work is yet to be replicated at a very high quality level. I also proposed to her that she should also look at the fathers who may carry a similar genetic pathway, but he never gets exposed to the estrogenic drugs. So somewhere we have to separate out the drug from the underlying susceptibility to cancer, which may also impair fertility. So what we, however, are also aware is that some of the drugs that are used for ovulation have restricted duration of use in order to prevent uterine cancers and ovarian cancers. So there is some concern over extended use and heavy-duty use of some drugs. However, this continues to be a very vexed and important issue, but one that's very difficult to do in most jurisdictions because of the extremely long lag times. But it actually is a study that can be done very well, particularly in Australia, because of the high-quality registries that we have, particularly in South Australia. So it's on our research agenda.
Thank you for that, Professor Davies. Do appreciate a professor leaping out of the audience. Look, I think, ladies and gents, that pretty much concludes tonight. I hope that you have got as much out of this conversation as I have. There's a lot of really important take-home messages. Eat well, smoke less, lose weight, shag earlier, shag lots. If something's not working, if you're getting a bit of menstrual disturbance, which is my take-home sentence or my take-home statement, menstrual disturbance, I've never heard that before, hop onto it as soon as you can, watch your shift work. I think it's been a really interesting night, and I would like you all now, please, to put your hands together for Louise Johnson, Professor Rob Norman, Dr. Deirdre Zander-Fox, Dr. Renee Fernandez, and Dr. John Schenken. Please put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you to the Robinson Institute for putting on this function again. Tonight, if you know someone that is trying to conceive a child and couldn't make it here tonight, or just is fascinated in this subject, this event has obviously been videoed, and within the next week it will be posted up on the Robinson Institute website, so make sure you connect with that, and tell them that obviously next year we'll be doing a similar event as well. So please connect as much as you can with South Australia's very own Robinson Institute, and you can learn all you need to know about life, I think. All right, ladies and gents, thank you very much. Please make sure you get some of those pamphlets, as Louise said in her talk, out on the front desk, and I really hope you've enjoyed tonight. Thank you very much.